This is House Planning Help, episode 156. Hello, I'm Ben Adam-Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Lisa Kerslake, Vice President of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. She's also Managing Director of Swift Ecology. And what we're going to do is venture out of the house today and into the garden. How can we make the most of our outdoor spaces, increasing biodiversity, thinking about planting wildlife, and so on? We'll move on to that in a few moments. A couple of episodes back, though, we were talking about the Potten Self-Build Show Centre in St Neots, and I said I'd let you know when the video went live. Well, that is your notification now. It's gone live, and we'll link it into today's show notes. A quick recap. In fact, I think I was even speaking to Hub member David a few moments ago, and he was saying that he'd been on this grand tour of going to the show centre there and off to the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre. Just a bit of a road trip to try and see what was there, what he can learn, all the rest of it. Well done, David. Good progress there. For me, what's great about the show centre is really just getting you excited about this whole project and understanding what it is you like and don't like. And it's difficult because I've been there so many times now, I take it all for granted what's there. 5 fully furnished show homes, so it's not just the exteriors because they're all different styles. They're mostly timber frame houses. However, the latest passive house that was built with structurally insulated panels, zips. And it just helps you with space as well if you're trying to think, well, how big is this room? Do I need it that size? So I thoroughly recommend, if you haven't been there, just penciling in a visit at some point. So you can drop in and out. It's really easy and actually just quite a bit of fun. So put that in the show notes, and links to Potten. It's well worth a visit. Let's get to our featured interview with Lisa Kerslake. Self-builders are very good at spending money on the houses, but they've normally run out by the time we get into the garden. So let's have a bit of planning up front. If we want to encourage nature and wildlife, what steps do we need to take? And that's why I wanted to chat to Lisa. She knows this area really, really well. And I started by asking her to tell me a little bit about her background.
I'm currently an ecological consultant, and I run my own business, mainly in the West Midlands, and we give advice to people who are putting in planning applications largely. So if you are putting in a development for, say, a small housing estate or something like that, quite often you need ecological surveys done. And a lot of wildlife in the UK is protected, and we do those surveys and give you that advice. So that's mostly what I'm doing at the moment. And I've also worked in more the voluntary and NGO and public sector jobs in the environment over the years also.
What is ecology, as a starter question?
Ecology is, to put it simply, the study of living things, I guess, and their relationship with each other, so animals and plants, and also with the wider environments of soils, air, water, and the way they interact and the impact that each of them has on the other. That's putting it fairly simply and quickly.
We haven't actually gone much outside the houses when we've been doing this podcast. So this is quite interesting for me today to take our gardens or potential areas that we're looking at and just think about it a little bit more. So when we arrive at a specific plot, are there any things that we should be considering when it comes to ecology?
There are a lot of things. It partly depends on what your plot is, in the sense that whether you've got a bit of brown field or whether it's already got vegetation on it. I mean, those two things could be quite different. So it may be quite hard to tell, and you may look at a field and think, well, that's not of any value for nature conservation or wildlife. But depending on what you've got there, then there might be quite a few things living on that site, from everything from plants to invertebrates through to common mammals like hedgehogs. All sorts of things that kind of live in the local environment that might actually use that local plot. But it may be actually very hard to tell what's on there without looking at it in more detail.
And that is what you might do in one of these studies, is sort of just assess things before anything happens.
That's right, yes. What we would do is go onto your site and look at it and look at, what we can actually see, so the plants and the animals that are actually evident, but also whether the habitats there are suitable for plants and animals that may not be evident at that time. So, for example, if I went out today, which is November, and did a study, a lot of plants wouldn't be flowering, some animals would be hibernating, they wouldn't be very evident. So it's also a case of looking at what you've got and assessing it to see whether at different times of year it might actually support animals that are rare or protected.
How much does this vary between cities towns, countryside? I know we're obviously expecting more living things in the countryside, but is there still this concern in the city?
Very much so. I mean, it's quite surprising how a lot of urban areas are actually very, very rich in wildlife. They may not have the levels of diversity that you find in the countryside, but then if you look at vast acres of very intensively managed farmland, for example, that often doesn't have an intrinsically high wildlife value. So in towns, you obviously get bats, you get foxes, you get hedgehogs, you get badgers, surprisingly enough, in some areas. And that's obviously just on the animal side. In terms of plants, you get some very interesting kind of plant communities, if you like, that tend to grow on disturbed ground that you don't tend to get in other areas, and the invertebrates that go along with that. So you can actually in cities have very, very varied environments.
You mentioned something quite interesting there about the countryside and farming. Obviously, it's important to be growing crops, but that has an impact. So I'm imagining that the ecology, let's say if we took the UK, has changed hugely in, I don't know, it could even be thousands of years, but certainly hundreds of years.
Massively, yeah. And most of the change has been probably in the last 100 years. I mean, it's that's just the way it's gone. Yes, there's been gradual changes as humankind have expanded and taken over more land. And one of the classic things, for example, is bats, which originally, when the UK and other areas were covered in woodland, bats would live in trees and in caves. And we've come along, we've removed most of the trees and we've quarried most of the caves. And bats, therefore, followed the stone and the wood into our houses. So therefore, you find bats in houses because that kind of, they give them the environment that they had before we chopped it all down. And yes, there have been massive changes. I mean, obviously, agriculture has intensified for, understandable reasons. You do have very, very large areas over to intensive agriculture in some parts of the country. And they're not devoid of wildlife by any means, but they may be much less. They may support much lower levels of wildlife than you would find in traditional hay meadows, for example, which are one of the things we've lost.
In terms of species that we've lost, have there been a lot in this geographic area? You certainly hear or read things that I never know whether you can quantify this, that 50% of all species on the planet has disappeared over the last 50 years, or I'm making this up, but along those lines. But what locally?
Locally, I mean, there have been declines in a lot of common, formerly common species. There's a good example, water voles, for example, which once upon a time were widespread across the UK. And they are what people know as ratty, and Wind in the Willows was actually, the people sometimes call them water rats. So it's actually a water vole, it's not a rat. And they were very, very widely dispersed across the whole of the UK, rivers and streams and ponds, and they have massively declined. And in Worcestershire, maybe there are 2 or 3 sites that we know of. They're very, very huge sort of decimation, really, of the population.
How does all of this impact, or can we just not really tell? Everything seems to go on as normal, but I'm assuming it doesn't really.
No, it doesn't. And it does all have an impact. And what we don't really know are the kind of wider implications as the years go by of this loss. I mean, a classic thing really is hedgehogs, where hedgehogs are sort of considered common. They don't have any protection. And yet I certainly notice far fewer hedgehogs dead on the road. Now, you may think that's a good thing because they're not getting squashed on the road, but probably the reason they're not getting squashed on the road is because there are fewer of them to get squashed on the road. So in that sense, is there a decline in hedgehogs? It's very difficult to measure because they're quite hard animals to survey for. So for everything that we do know about, like water voles, there is something else that we don't really know about, like hedgehogs. And the combined effect of that, yes, could be quite large.
Getting back to our own plots and trying to encourage nature and wildlife, what things can we do? I'm assuming it's not going to be as easy as just as a blanket, do this, do that.
It depends on a lot of things, really. It will vary on what your plot is like, what's already there. I mean, quite often people will look at a site and think, I want to plant some trees, I want to create this, that and the other. And often it may be easier and cheaper to work with what you've got. If you're looking at a garden, for example, if you've got more or less a blank canvas and you wanted to create a garden that was good for wildlife, then there are a few key things you can look at. One is to work with the soil that you've got. So it's quite important to know that, there's no point trying to plant things that only grow in alkaline soils if you're on acid soils. So work with the environment that you've got. That's quite important. To make sure that you plant things that that grow and blossom and fruit over the extended period of the season, if you like, so that you've got flowers and fruit all the way through, which then feed invertebrates, birds and other animals, as you know, all the way up the food chain, so that you've constantly got something in your garden that things can feed on. Native species are always good, so try to avoid things like laurel and conifers generally, which, you know, may grow very densely and give you a good screen, but they're quite devoid of wildlife. So trying to sort of mix in native species where you can, and also things that aren't native but actually do really attract animals, such as butterflies. A buddleia, for example, is a classic example. I mean, it's lovely for butterflies. It does, however, grow like a weed. So you do need to be sure that if you can plant something like buddleia, you've got the space for it, or you keep control of it. Things like paracantha and other things that produce berries, which are very, very good for birds, along with, you know, as many native species as you can get in there, is always a good thing.
Where does ecology intersect with landscaping or planning of your garden?
Well, that's obviously very important, because you may have a vision for your garden in landscape terms, but within that, there is an awful lot you can do to encourage ecology. So as I say, not just typical garden plants, try to mix in more native species where it's appropriate, and just consider leaving areas wild. For example, a little bit of rough grassland scrub can be massively beneficial for wildlife if you've got the space. Compost heaps, very good for wildlife. You know, not only do they support good colonies of worms, things like grass snakes will lay their eggs in them. And if you're in the right area, you might be lucky and get dormice hibernating in them. It doesn't often happen, but if you've got them, that'd be great. So there's a massive amount you can do, but you do need to look at what you've got really and sort of plan it in from the beginning, I think.
Perhaps a quick sidestep here, but I've noticed more and more that people have been putting in fake grass and ditching hanging baskets for these fake plants everywhere. And in towns, certainly, I think it's an issue. Does this impact in a big way on ecology? Because, of course, the other way of looking at it is that if every garden had a carbon footprint, well, perhaps they wouldn't need to mow all of this grass, and they don't need to do anything once it's done. Then that's it for a good few years.
Yeah, it's difficult to know, obviously. I mean, you've got two things there. If you're using artificial things like astroturf and similar artificial features, then A, what are they made of? I suspect it's probably something not very environmentally friendly. I don't know, but I suspect it's not. And B, in themselves, they don't support any wildlife. So you've got a kind of double whammy there in the sense that they're not very valuable. Yes, you may be saving on your mowing and that sort of things. Absolutely, you might. But in terms of, if you're looking at purely supporting wildlife, then you're not doing very much good at all. And it would be better to think about cutting down on your mowing and leaving grass to grow for longer, and putting in plants that don't need so much management, rather than replacing it with astroturf.
Right at the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned that you deal a lot in planning. So what aspects of this come into planning?
Well, there's quite a lot, really. I mean, quite often we will go onto a site and we will find that the site either has evidence of or potential for protected species, for example. And in that situation, what you might do is say, look, if you do this in a certain way, you can retain the protected species you've got, you can enhance the environment for them. National planning policy now encourages you to enhance biodiversity in any development. So there are an awful lot of things you can do, planting nectar-rich plants, for example, that you can put into a kind of biodiversity method statement, if you like, that goes along with your planning application, which says this is what we're going to do for the environment. And there are certain things that are critical, and it's not specifically outside, but if you look at modern houses going up now, and nearly always the roofs are nearly always lined with breathable roofing membranes. They are lethal for bats. So that sort of thing, which is, you know, consideration if you've got bats on a site that are, you know, going under the tiles on your roof, if you replace that roof with a roofing membrane rather than traditional roofing felt, that only means that it's not good for bats, it means that the bats will destroy the properties that make the breathable roofing membrane breathable. So there's all sorts of very general and also very specific things that might come out of a survey that tells you this is what you've got on your plot, and this is how you best conserve it, this is how you can improve it, and this, by the way, is actually things that you really need to think about doing.
If we want to increase our knowledge on this area, how do we do that? Are there any websites you can recommend, or do we need to hire people, consultants like you?
It's a vast subject. There is a lot of advice out there on various websites about, how to create a wildlife garden, that sort of thing. And a Google search would pick up a lot of stuff. The RHS are quite good for, the different qualities. Sorry, that's the Royal Horticultural Society, are good for different plants and, the typical things you find in the garden, the different qualities of those. So, just doing a Google search would come up with a lot of information for you on that. If you did need to employ a consultant, then CIEEM has a professional directory. Sorry, that's the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. And we have a professional directory which gives you details of people in your area that can give you this advice. Your local wildlife trust may well have information on how you can improve your local environment in terms of your garden and the immediate surrounds. And also the RSPB has had a very big campaign about giving nature a home. So there are all sorts of resources that you can use.
And just looking on a wider scale, can we improve in a big way if we got behind this? Could we make a big difference?
Massively. And you can do it in very small ways. For example, if you've got a fence around your garden, I want to say a wooden panel fence, just for the sake of argument, just by lifting the bottom of that fence a little, one panel of that fence, will allow a hedgehog to get through and move between gardens, and that would previously be an absolutely impenetrable barrier for a hedgehog. May sound small, but if a few people do it and then more people do it, then obviously the difference that can make is exponential. Just something like a small pond in your garden, putting water in your garden is one of the most significant things you can do for wildlife. Even if it's only the size of it, like a Belfast sink or one of these like pre-molded plastic liners, you can still get frog spawn, toad spawn, things like that in there, which are very, very beneficial. Plus it provides somewhere for birds to drink and bathe, and other animals as well. So there are a lot of little things you can do that make a big difference.
And other borders too, hedges, fences, how would you choose between them? Are there any better than others, or again, is it down to individual situations?
Well, I mean, to an extent, it depends on how security-proof your property needs to be, but certainly I would always recommend, if you're putting a hedge in, to make a largely native hedge, using things like hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, field maple, holly, all of which are very, very good for wildlife, support birds in terms of nesting, and have flowers and fruit that animals can feed on. As I said earlier, try to avoid massive hedges of laurel and conifer, which basically are devoid of wildlife, really. I mean, birds will nest in them, but that's about all they'll do, really. Fences, sometimes you'll need a fence, but as I say, just think about, leaving a gap underneath it so things can get through, maybe trailing a climbing plant over it so that it's not completely bare. Just even things like ordinary common ivy, which is a native plant, is massively useful for birds in the winter, because late winter it tends to have berries then when other plants don't have them.
We talked quite a bit about the landscape in the garden, but are there any habitats that we can almost create, bird boxes or equivalent?
Absolutely. Bird and bat boxes are very, very valuable in all sorts, city and country. They can be very, very well used. They're relatively cheap to buy, relatively cheap to install. What I would say is, if you are doing a new build, for example, then it's better to put integrated bird and bat boxes in, because they're in the fabric of the building. You don't need to maintain them. They don't rot. They don't bother you. And certain species, like swifts, for example, they've suffered quite a lot with loss of suitable nesting sites. And it's actually relatively easy to create nesting sites for swifts if you've got a suitable building. And common birds like sparrows, people quite often surprised to find that sparrows and starlings have declined quite a lot. And again, you can provide very good nesting opportunities for them in and around your own buildings and on trees if you've got trees. But as I say, this is an easy win in order to attract wildlife into your garden.
I wonder whether you could give us an example of just a project that you've worked on and how you've been able to improve the ecology of that site.
Yes, of course. There's a site that we worked on in North Warwickshire, which was a small self-build type development with small houses where the plots are being sold off. And there was a pond on the site and some mature trees, but it was very overgrown, a lot of nettles, a lot of scrub. And in that situation, we did some surveys, discovered there were reptiles on the site, for example. The pond, although it didn't support any protected species, it did have a number of amphibians in it. The trees were valuable for wildlife. And we were able to give advice to improve the biodiversity of that site by incorporating features that the animals that were already there could use and would also be beneficial for other animals and other species that might come in. So, for example, ensuring that habitat for that was suitable for reptiles, so long grass and scrub, was actually maintained around the edge of the plot so that it wasn't all totally incorporated into everybody's garden. Rubble piles were used. Again, can be very beneficial for amphibians and reptiles. Managing the ponds so that it didn't overgrow, it retained its size and its open water as well as shallow areas, so that continues to be used and become more valuable for wildlife. And appropriate management of the trees so that they could be, where some of the limbs were diseased and possibly dangerous, they could be removed, but without removing the entire tree, so that was retained into the future. So in that site, we were able to enhance it for a wide range, if you like, of different species.
A word on budgets, then, that if we haven't got too much money to play with, how could we make that money go as far as possible?
Quite often, wildlife-friendly gardening is actually reasonably cheap because you're managing things less than you would be in a very beautifully manicured garden. So once you've got your shrubs and your grasslands in, then you shouldn't be needing to sort of trim those back every 5 minutes. So that actually can be quite a cost-effective way of creating a very good habitat.
Are there any other areas that we should be thinking about in this overview of ecology and how we might be able to improve it on our sites?
I think how you actually manage your garden, your plot, and just look not to manage it so that it's absolutely manicured. If you can keep a few wilder areas, set aside a bank that you use as a wildflower bank, so you would only mow it maybe once or twice a year rather than every week during the summer period. All these things can make massive difference to the amount of wildlife in your garden, because everything feeds up, if you like. Invertebrates feed on plants, birds feed on invertebrates, and so on up the food chain. So if you start small and think about how you're managing things and providing some variety in terms of structure, flowering plants, it all feeds up the chain.
And is it the case that if we just let an area of land go completely wild, would that be the best ecology, or can you improve it always?
Well, if you bought a plot and did nothing to it, then eventually it would go to woodland, but that would take obviously a very, very long time. And in the meantime, you'd start off with longer grass, and you get bits of scrub coming in and so on. And yes, that's a very valuable habitat, but it is just one habitat. And one of the things we find, certainly in the UK, which is because the population is so high, is about what we call halting succession. So halting that succession from grassland through to woodland, and therefore creating a more diverse environment. So in a woodland, for example, you might keep some of the rides mown down the middle and then have taller edges. So you've got a mixture of grassland, scrub and woodland in one area, rather than having it all grassland, all scrub or all woodland. So the key to this is often diversity. So if you can get as many different habitats within your plot as you can, then that's much more beneficial for wildlife.
Lisa, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
We've been taking the notes, so you don't have to. You can reflect upon them at houseplanninghelp.com/156. We've also got links to the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management and to Swift Ecology. Perhaps you have a question or you'd like to make a comment, you can do that at the bottom of the show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/156. My call to action is to get on the VIP early bird list for the Hub. Enrollment is currently closed, but be the first to find out when it's going to reopen, along with all of the benefits. The two main reasons why I set up the Hub, because it's been going for over a year now, it was generally to support self-builders who I feel there's nowhere that they can turn to. Perhaps it could even be something really simple. You've got a question and you just want to put it to other people in the same boat. Some will be ahead, some will be behind, but everyone will have some experience. And I think it can get lonely. Sometimes it's just a shoulder to cry on. So that was an important side, the community. And then I run a production company. That's my main business, Regen Media. So I felt that I could do a lot more with video that just doesn't seem to happen. And I hope over the years that this can get better and better and building up momentum. So we've got the in-depth video case studies. We had Long Barrow following through the entire story of these builds stage by stage. And then our second one is Buckinghamshire Passive House. And I may have news of a third one that we're looking to embark on soon. I know it's all happening. We've got the progress calls where the community just gets together and we talk through some of our challenges, the modules, the private members forum that I've talked about. So houseplanninghelp.com/join. Get yourself on the VIP early bird list for the Hub when we open again in 2017. Next time, we have a case study. James Galpin from Hazel McCormack Young Architects takes us through the development of Mayfield Passive House. It's a country house, timber-clad, beautiful, the gardens as well. I mean, it's pretty much set around the garden. So thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.